Okay, if you've been around any of these critical thinking presentations before, you will know that I have been doing critical thinking skill 4, and I've done that several times. This year, Mary Ruth got volunteers for critical skill 4 before she filled out the schedule for this, and still was lacking somebody for 3. So, being a glutton for punishment, I said, I'll do it, I'll take 3 and see what I can do with it. So I have not actually explicitly incorporated critical skill 3 into the class yet, and I'm in the process of doing it, so I'm going to be showing you kind of how I'm moving with this skill in the class I'm going to be working with it in. Also, we'll take a look at this that was in your packet, this form for enhancements. This is something you're going to be working with today and tomorrow, especially tomorrow. And I'm going to try to sort of follow along that form, talking about rationale, activity, and assessment as best I can. And again, as a work in progress. It's not there yet, but it's in progress. Those who have heard me talk about this before know that the big thing for me on this whole critical skill is that we are not adding a new component to our classes. We're not taking classes and saying, oh, now we have this list of things that we've got to somehow find a way to teach this in addition to everything else we do. To me, it is a matter of looking at our classes to figure out where we're already doing critical thinking, what kinds of critical thinking are we doing, and how can these skills help us do it better and teach it better. As I was thinking about that this summer, it occurred to me that an illustration that I ran into several years ago in the desktop publishing class, we used a book by Robin Williams, not the actor Robin Williams, graphic designer, a woman named Robin Williams, called the Non-Designer's Design Book. And she starts the book with what she calls the Joshua Tree principle. And this was based on her experience, an experience of hers from childhood. When she was a young girl, she said she enjoyed flora and fauna and nature and was very interested in all those sorts of things. And one year she got a book, a picture book of trees of the world. And it was one of these lavishly illustrated books with these beautiful full-color illustrations of trees and then descriptions of the trees beside them. As she was flipping through the book, she came across a picture of a Joshua tree. And she thought, wow, that is an amazing tree. She read the story about it and she was like, wow, this is so cool. I wish we had trees like that around here because I would love to see one in real life. And then she said later in the day she went out to play with some friends, and as she was walking through the neighborhood she noticed a Joshua tree in almost every yard. And she said, why had I never seen them before? And she said the reason is because I never had a label. I never had a conceptual framework, so to speak, to say this is what this is. So she said, I looked at them, but I never had really seen it. And I thought it's a great illustration for what we're doing with these critical thinking skills. When I look at a class, there's critical thinking going on all over that syllabus and all over that class and the activities of the class, but I've not labeled them before. And so it's the labeling of it that helps me to see it and hopefully is going to help me to teach the students better. So when I was given this skill and said, okay, you're going to, this year, rather than 4, which I'd been doing with my media law class, you're going to be taking on this skill of explaining causes. So I said, okay, which of the classes do I teach that seems to just have this skill all over it, but I'd never kind of looked at it before? And the class that came to mind was my research methods class. It's kind of an obvious one. And really, this is a class you could take skill 2 or skill 3 because both of them are pretty integrated into doing research methods. But the way we teach the research methods, the way I've been teaching it, I think this skill is the more maybe pivotal skill for the students to get. And as I looked at this class, I went back to the syllabus and noticed that the first two of the behavioral objectives that are already in the existing syllabus connect nicely to this explaining causes skill. First one, describe the purpose and value of communication research. It goes on to talk a little bit more about the varying fields and in our discipline. But when I looked at that, I thought, okay, purpose, value of research. What is the purpose and the value of research if it's not to explain causes of human behavior? We're trying to say, why do people do what they do in communication? Why do they self-disclose in the ways that they do? Why are they influenced by persuasive speaking? Why are they influenced by advertising? Or are we influenced by advertising? How do we know? What are the causes of our behavior and the communicational causes? So connection right there in that first behavioral objective. And the second behavioral objective says demonstrate knowledge of the elements of research design according to each of the major methodologies of the communication research field. So again, elements of design, well, to me, design in research arose to answer the question, how can we know why people do what they do? We've come up with a variety of research designs to try to address that problem. That is, to identify those causes and pick likely causes. So here's a skill that's like that Joshua tree. It's been there in the syllabus, kind of hiding out, until I now have a label for it. It's skill number 3. And I can now put that label to it, and what I'm planning to do this fall is to tweak these objectives in the syllabus just a little bit so that the language of skill 3 gets in there. And so that when we talk about purpose and value, we will explicitly say to explain causes of human behavior, and research methodologies to help us search for possible evidence in order to choose cause correctly. Now, the other thing that I do with classes is, in addition to saying which skill fits there, then the second step for me is to say, okay, where in the class is the critical question or the critical juncture at which point teaching the skill would be really helpful? I think for me, and again, I haven't done it yet this year, but where I'm going to try to put it in this year, is at the point, 2 points kind of in the class. One, the complexity of human behavior and the complexity of causes. Human behavior is not easy to understand in terms of why we do what we do, and there's a lot of reason that we deal with early in the class. And then secondly, the problem of it's possible to find things that go together, that is, that correlate with each other, but to determine that one actually causes the other one is pretty tricky. We know that Chick-fil-A sales went up when they started using cows in their advertising. We know that. Do we know for sure that the cows caused it? How do you know that? I've always taught this. This is not a new piece in this class. It's a big chunk of the class is to get students to kind of work with this. One semester I was teaching it, and a student emailed me this little cartoon he found online somewhere. The guy says, I used to think correlation implied causation. Then I took a statistics class. Now I don't. She says, well, sounds like the class helped. Maybe. I'm not sure if it caused it or not. Well, these are the 2 points, kind of the complexity of human behavior and the difficulty of establishing that just because these two things go together, one actually cause the other. So that's the rationale for why I put this in here. The activity, there's a variety of activities I do to teach this. And these are activities I've already been doing in the class. Now I'm going to try to do them in the context of talking about this skill. And the main one is showing students examples of research that have been conducted, either talking about research I've done or finding published research studies of varying types, exposing them to this research and then getting them to think about what were the aims of the research, what were they trying to determine, and did they use a methodology that allowed them to accomplish those aims. One personal example that I like to use was not actually a communication study, but a study I did when I did a church growth class many years ago in one of my graduate programs. A major assignment for the class was to find a rapidly growing church and do a graphical representation of their growth and then do interviews to determine why this growth had taken place. Well, I immediately thought of what had formerly been a little country church outside of Atlanta, Prospect United Methodist, that I knew of, and I knew in the last 8 or 10 years they had grown dramatically. When I first heard of the church, they looked, this isn't the church, but they looked a little like this. The stereotypical little country church in the grove of trees with a cemetery behind it is what they looked like. And I knew that in the past few years they'd built a new worship center, they had built an education building, they'd built a recreational center. They had grown pretty dramatically. So I wanted to identify the causes. Well, first I did my statistical charts, and sure enough, they had grown pretty remarkably over the last 8 or 10 years. So then I went and spent a long weekend at the church talking to various people about why they had grown. I interviewed the pastor, and he gave me an absolute, clear, unequivocal answer. He said, I know it's not in style anymore, in fashion anymore, especially in United Methodist circles, but he said, I'm an old-fashioned preacher and I teach soul winning. He says, that's the reason we've grown. I emphasize personal evangelism. I talk about going door to door. I get them out there witnessing to their neighbors and to their co-workers. And he says, I emphasize it. I value it. I commend people for doing it. And he says, that's why we've grown the way we have. I talked to people in the staff of the church. Why have you grown like this in these last few years? And they said, it's all due to our small group ministry. We have a small group ministry called Vine Life here. And every member of the church is a grape. And every grape is in a cluster. So every cluster has a cluster leader that is accountable for them, and they're accountable to that cluster. Every cluster is on a branch, and every branch has branch leaders, and they're accountable to the branch leaders. The cluster leaders are, and then every branch is in the vine, and the vine has vine leaders, and the branches are all, and they said every person who comes into this church, the moment we identify a newcomer, we try to get them into a group, and they become accountable, and they become embedded in the vine life, and that's what has kept the church growing. Well, then I talked to some of the laity of the church, people who'd been there for years, since before it had grown to now. And they came back very frequently citing it was the pastor who was responsible. They said he is a dynamic biblical preacher. He preaches strong fundamental sermons straight from the Bible, pure Word of God, and people hear him and they want to hear